The speculative utopia has always been informed by scientific advances, whether through control of the environment, reproduction, or the eradication of disease. Both science and any utopia seek to improve the human condition, to render the universe comprehensible, and to provide a sense of order. To update the feminist utopia, writers need to be conscious of and utilise new scientific discovery into DNA, neuroscience, and gender. Much builds on Ursula Le Guin's groundbreaking works from the mid-20th century, which questioned what it means to be male or female. This work largely focused on cultural determinants of gender, removing gender-specific pronouns and traditional roles. Science was used as a tool, for example, to remove parenting from only women by using alternative methods of reproduction. Le Guin wrote in The Left Hand of Darkness, "I suppose the heaviest single factor in one's life is whether one's born male or female. In most societies, it determines one's expectations, activities, outlook, ethics, manners, almost everything." In her novel, Le Guin presents us with a gender thought experiment. By creating an androgynous race called the Gethians, she explores what it might mean to live without patriarchy and the social prescription of being male or female. Despite being androgynous, the Gethians take on temporary sexual characteristics, either male or female, during the act of reproduction, a period Le Guin terms chema. Gethians do not choose the sex, it being an involuntary hormone response to the other partner. Since the second half of the 20th century, new technologies in DNA sequencing and cell biology reveal that sex and gender is no longer a binary question, an either-or such as Le Guin imagined, with temporary, distinct female and male parts. Almost everyone has a patchwork of cells, some with a sex or chromosome that might not match the rest of their body. In their glossary of terms, the Safe Zone Project lists more than 45 gender expressions and identities, as well as multiple sexes. Judith Butler, in her recent interview on the culture wars and trans rights, comments, "My sense is that we have to renew the feminist commitment to gender equality and gender freedom in order to affirm the complexity of gendered lives as they are currently being lived." Butler sees gender as a performance imposed by normative heterosexual traditions, such as the language and symbolism used to define it. She views gender as a flexible concept in an ever-changing landscape. Feminism has always been committed to the proposition that the social meanings of what it is to be a man or a woman are not yet settled. We tell histories about what it meant to be a woman at a certain time and place, and we track the transformation of those categories over time. Using the latest research available, we, as writers, need to consider whether we can build a kinetic utopian world which allows individuals to define their own sex and gender using a spectrum rather than a dichotomy, mutually influenced by culture and biology. For the purposes of this paper, biological sex identity will be defined in scientific terms on the absence or presence of the Y chromosome, and gender identity will be defined in terms of social construction, which begins in utero if parents are told the sex of the fetus. Gender identity follows cultural traditions, gender-appropriate colours, social expectations, including a capacity to think logically, and gender-appropriate behaviour. Real-world science and events are the basis from which authors of speculative fiction imagine the future. Until recently, neuroscientific research has been grounded in the belief that men and women's brains are inherently different and therefore function differently. Scientists such as Simon Baron-Cohen still argue this, drawing on Darwin's theory of natural selection to assert that men are more systemizing and women empathizing, having evolved to fit their roles. According to Gina Rippon, our understanding of the brain and the science we have utilised to study these differences has historically reinforced binary stereotypes. Traditionally, we have measured and tested our brains in order to prove that difference, rather than question whether our motivation for research is producing the answers we expect. Rippon argues that the brain is not male or female by design, and certainly not static, shaped only in childhood. Rather, the brain is plastic and flexible, limited only by the information it is fed. Nature and nurture are explicably entangled in brain activity, and something written in our genes may come to express itself differently in different contexts. Rippon concludes that a gendered world will produce a gendered brain. Of course, utopian writers like Le Guin, Piercy and Russ have always believed there is no difference in intellect between the sexes, but this was based on cultural rather than scientific evidence. Joanna Russ, in her novel The Female Man, wrote, "I didn't and don't want to be a feminine version or a diluted version or a special version or a subsidiary version or an ancillary version or an adapted version of the heroes I admire. I want to be the heroes themselves." By arguing there are no sex differences in the brain, we can begin to imagine the brain, like gender, has a spectrum of capability. It is not just the capability of the brain we need to consider, but conditions which affect its development. Epigenetics studies the way in which DNA expression is influenced by social and environmental factors. Research by L.H. Loomy, an epidemiologist at Columbia University, who based his study on the Dutch Hongerwinter of 1944, discovered that starvation caused certain genes to deactivate in children in utero at the time of the event. Effectively, the trauma caused genes in these unborn children to be silenced. These genetic changes, occurring by a process called methylation, led to long-term conditions including diabetes, obesity, and schizophrenia. The trauma suffered by mothers during periods of starvation left a lasting genetic imprint on their children, which it is believed continued several generations on. In addition to epigenetic changes occurring in utero, there is growing evidence that changes can also occur over a lifetime and that sperm plays a significant part in epigenetic inheritance, influencing both the health and development of offspring. Epigenetic changes can also be considered a gendered experience. In a recent study of the effect of BPA in utero, it was discovered that due to a gendered preference for cosmetics, women had far higher levels of parabens in their urine than men. Animal studies have shown that parabens have an effect on both brain function and behaviour. In other words, it's possible that these epigenetic changes in utero caused by the plastics in cosmetics in order to affirm gender characteristics might contribute to deviations in the appearance of males and females. It is very difficult to replicate the findings of epigenetic studies due to ethical considerations. We cannot remove a child from its mother, put a mother under stress in order to study the effects of separation, or remove sections of the brain to study. What we do know is that the biology of a child is influenced by the hormonal environment of the womb and the experience of their forebears. Historically, feminist utopian fiction has used catastrophic events such as war and pandemics to provide plausible breaks from the known world and gateways into representations of utopian worlds. These traumatic events make generational epigenetic transmission an interesting concept for modern writers of utopian fiction to hypothesize. Current research into epigenetics as a means of biological transmission suggests we need to move away from the idea of creating a blueprint for a blank slate world for humans in speculative fiction to occupy, cut off and separated from any civilization they wish to escape. As writers, we need to acknowledge that information is not only carried in the mind, in language and institutions, but also by the body. In terms of critical practice, we need to consider the advances in genetics, neuroscience and gender studies, and create an authentic world that reflects both our cultural and physical present. Where Le Guin used science to imagine equality of gender, a knowledge of epigenetics and neuroscience will allow us to start from a point of neutrality, with no sex differences in brain capacity, and where we imagine sex and gender as a spectrum rather than a binary argument. Despite current scientific knowledge struggling to ascertain with certainty the impact of epigenetics on gender and whether it is reversible, there is a need for understanding how it might shape us, irrespective of tradition and culture. The concept of the utopia has always imagined scientific advances as a way to open the doors to cultural and biological transformation, and a modern feminist utopia is the perfect platform to consider the impact of this new information, how it will define both characters' experience and their place in the worlds we seek to create.